This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking with a man named George Lane, who is an expert on the Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan, and that era in history. And when we get back, I will be spending the next hour or two talking with him about his life and career, researching that, and his books. Well, I want to welcome George Lane to the show here, and I basically just want to give a little 30 or 60-second introduction as to why I wanted to talk about Genghis Khan. And for those people who have watched my video interviews, and this one on the Mongols is, I think, number 28. I've also did over 40 interviews that were written interviews. And one of my early written interviews, I had, well, in a number of them, I had a question about contingency and the butterfly effect. And one of the questions that always interested me in history was, what if there had been no Genghis Khan? Because to me, Genghis Khan was one of the most influential people of all time. And if you removed him from history, and the Mongols, would the Mongols have spread out? Would they have inhibited China, which drew inward? Or if there's no Mongols, would the Chinese have gone over to America and colonized parts of it? Without the Mongols, would the Muslims have expanded further and maybe conquered Europe? So anyway, I asked questions to some of my early interviewees, and one of them was Daniel Dennett, a well-known American philosopher. And he sort of dismissed the claim with a little semi-humorous remark. But I asked it because I'd seen him and a number of people like Steven Pinker and some other intellectuals on one of these turn of the century shows in '99 or 2000. You know, what was the greatest thing of the last century? What was the greatest thing of the last 1,000 years? And they asked one of the questions, who was the most influential person of the last 1,000 years? To me, it had to be Genghis Khan for some of the reasons I just barely mentioned. But he wasn't mentioned. A lot of scientists, Christopher Columbus, this, that, and the other thing were mentioned, but no mention of Genghis Khan. Now, it could have been, you know, European or Eurocentric bias, but it just seemed to me that there's a lot of ignorance about Khan and the Mongols and that whole era. So this eventually led me to do this show. So with that preamble, let me just turn it over to George. Thank you again for appearing. And if you could tell the viewers and the listeners a little bit about yourself and what drew you to the Mongols and that era and part of the world.
I was drawn to the Mongols because of my teacher at the time for my BA, David Morgan. He ignited my interest, but also because I had quite a knowledge of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is associated with the Mongols in many ways. So it was a mixture of Afghanistan in my early days, and then my career has been rather varied. I didn't start my academic career until I was almost 40. I spent 25 years in a gap year. A lot of the time I spent, in fact, in Afghanistan and the Middle East. So by the time I came to do my BA, the Mongols was a connection with my youth. And that's how I first got interested. Also for the fact that he was that people used to dismiss the Mongols. They had such an impact, and yet for historians, that period was a dark period, a black period, and it was often just skipped over. I wanted to know why it was treated like that, and I thought they had to be more. If they'd have conquered half the world, they had to be more than just a mishap of history.
Yeah, I know. It seems to me that he gets lumped together with a lot of the Attila the Hun types and you know, these just sort of barbarian hordes generically, whereas he clearly was someone from, you know, and I probably know far less than you, was someone more akin to Alexander the Great, in that he had some vision, he had these ideas, because from what I know, and in the course of this show, you know, you had maybe about 6,000 or 7,000 years of just horsemen riding across the high steppes of Upper Mongolia or Outer Mongolia, just raping and killing and looting for millennia. And then here comes this one guy, and within his lifetime, he takes all of these tribes, he conquers his own tribe, he avenges, you know, some family wrongdoing, he he basically makes a state out of these warring tribes, and they take on China, which was then the lone superpower in the world, conquer most of that, move out across Asia, and depending on who you ask, it was either the Mongols or the Soviet Union as the largest land empire ever, and it's just remarkable because there's no precedent for that. I mean, Alexander the Great, there was the basis of the Greek empire that he expanded. It seems to me that he's Genghis Khan is such an outlier, and that there were a lot of reforms. He wasn't just this barbarian that killed. Yeah, he killed a lot of people, probably more than anyone before the 20th century. But I mean, there was religious freedom. There was encouragement of small business, if you want to call it that. There was respect for people's differences. It was maybe the first truly multicultural society where non-Mongols could rise, as far as I know, in the I guess you call the courtly or the Khanate system. So is that some of the misconceptions that you've aimed to tackle?
Well, a lot. He was, in many ways, he was the right man at the right time. But this idea that he arose out of the steppe and conquered all before him is not quite true. He had a lot of allies. He was greeted by a lot of groups, and I think this is often a misconception that he just defeated all that was before him. No, he had a lot of help, and a lot of people allied themselves with him. He led a revolution. And I think, as I pointed out before, we often talk of the Mongols, but that's a misconception, or a misnomer, as you've touched upon. They ceased to be just Mongols within a decade or so of him riding out of the steppe in 1206. As you said, he led a multicultural movement. People joined him. The Mongols became a minority within his movement very, very quickly. So I think a more correct term would be the Chinggisids of Genghis Khan. So the Chinggisids, everybody joined them in. Anyone could rise up the ranks. It was only the very top positions, the royal family, that was maybe preserved for an ethnic Mongol. Otherwise, anyone could rise up, and everybody did rise up.
Well, let's in this segment focus on the man himself. He was known, I guess, initially just as Temujin, and his father was, I guess, a minor Khan or within whatever local tribe, and the sort of history of him is that he battled his own brothers. He supposedly slew one of his own brothers. He avenged his father's death at the hand of one of the rival clans. And
but the first thing perhaps to mention is that yes, he was one of the clans. He was one of the Mongols, but the Mongols were just one of many of the different groups. There were Tartars, there were Nayman, there were Merkids. The Mongols were simply one of these Turco-Mongol steppe groups.
The man himself is a lot of the legendary, and there was the famous book that the history of the Mongol Empire. I think that was sort of early PR for the Khanate, written, I guess, around the time of Genghis Khan's death.
The secret history of the Mongols.
What?
The secret history of the Mongols.
That's right. So how much of that was just sort of agitprop from the Khanate, and how much of that do people accept as true history?
The basically it have, because there was another book which never survived but was copied by Rashid ad-Din. So some of the basic chronology is accepted. The stories of perhaps him killing his brother and what have you. The fact that his father was murdered by the Tartars, another Turco-Mongol group. That's true. The fact that he, after his father's death, his immediate family were left to fend for themselves. I mean, he was treated very badly. He had to fight his way up, and he resented the fact that the rest of the tribe deserted him, and he remembered it. He remembered it when he came to seek revenge on the Tartars who had killed his father, and on some of the other groups who mistreated him. So his early experiences of a harsh life, they were reflected in his revenge and then his eventual conquering of all of the tribes. That was his genius, the fact that he was able to conquer them and then to unite them as well.
So let me just stick with who he was. Now he was an ethnic Mongol, but does that necessarily mean that almost 1,000 years ago they were like the Mongols of today, or what was there more of a mix? I mean, was did they have the more classic Mongoloid features? Because we don't have any real records of what he looked like, do we?
Well, there are pictures, and yes, no doubt he was Asiatic looking, but they were mixed. I mean, all these various groups, the Tartars, the Nayman, the Merkids, etc., they intermarried. They were not allowed to marry within the clan, so they had to seek wives outside. So there was a lot of mixing. And they had slaves, they sold, and other people when they conquered. So there was a lot of intermixing. I mean, just as today, you can't. There's no thing as a pure Mongol. They were mixed. Even linguistically, they were mixed. And a more correct term would be the Turco-Mongols. They spoke a mixture of Mongolian languages and Turkic languages. So the features, yes, we do have pictures of Genghis Khan, and we can assume that they have some accuracy. Now, I think they exist in the museum, the National Museum of Taiwan.
Taiwan.
They've collected them for whatever reasons, but that's where they still exist.
So let's talk though about the Mongol tribes and the tribes of Outer Mongolia. As I mentioned, from what I know of, there was no real. They were not really considered a great threat because China, and when we talk about China, we're really talking about 4 or 5, different Chinas at the time, because there was no monolithic China either.
There was the Song dynasty. They were ruling in the south. In the north were the so-called the Qin or the Jin, the Gurchin. Now they were very unpopular. They ruled the North China, but they were resented by the southern Chinese, the Song dynasty, the great Song dynasty, which goes way back into history, and also by the so-called Khitans, who the Gurchin, and this is an important part of history. The Gurchin had come down from Manchuria. They had come down about 1120, and they had expelled the Song dynasty to the south, where they set up their capital in Hangzhou, and they'd expelled the Khitans. The Khitans that remained were second-class citizens. Both those two groups, and this is so important, both those two groups wanted to come back. They wanted to get their revenge on these Gurchin. They were seen as usurpers. These were some of the first people that Genghis Khan actually went after. So they have been manipulated. In history, the Turco-Mongol tribes have been manipulated by the sedentary people. They fought them off one against the other. And this was a pattern that Genghis Khan himself had witnessed.
Now, so we're talking that at the same time that Temujin was uniting the people of Outer Mongolia, China sort of fell, or the Chinese people were sort of in disarray. So it seemed like a very fortuitous time in history for him to rise then.
In a way, but in disarray is probably the wrong word. They were settled. The Gurchin were settled in northern China. The Song were settled in the south, but there was animosity between the two groups. The Gurchin were still manipulated. The Turco-Mongol tribes were in disarray. It's that Temujin slowly built his way up with political skills, military skills. He was fighting one group against another. But in 1206, he managed to defeat all the Turco-Mongol tribes and he united them. But his problem was this: he had united them, but then he had nothing to feed them. They had to start looking. That's how they survived, by fighting each other, robbing each other, and this is something which the sedentary world had used against them. Genghis Khan had united them, but now he had to go elsewhere to get the goodies, to keep them loyal, to keep them fed, and he of course looked to China, and he wanted to use it. Also, remember, there's evidence to suggest that Genghis Khan had spent some time in China. There's a year of his life which is unaccounted for. Nobody knows exactly what happened to him. It was in his in sometime about 1200. He disappeared off the radar. It's believed that he spent that time in China, either as a prisoner or as a guest. We don't know.
I had not heard that. So let's talk about him as a military. We talked about some of his political skills. He's probably most famed as one of the top 4 or 5 military thinkers in world history, along with an Alexander the Great, and usually some of his generals are ranked aside. Did he draw his generalship from conquered tribes, or were they mostly from his own clan or his own tribe?
System. Hello?
Yeah.
He dissolved the tribal system. He realized that, in a sense, that was a strength, but also it was a weakness. He'd experienced a very bad side of that. So he dissolved the tribal system and he rebuilt it in a decimal way. He had at the top, he had people who had stuck by him throughout all, and he made them commanders of 10,000. They were taken from different tribes, but they were in charge. Thereafter, the commanders of 10,000 were in charge of groups of 10,000. Under that, there were commanders of 1,000. Under that, there were commanders of 100, right down to commanders of 10. This system and these new groups were built of people from all the tribes. When he conquered, the conquered people were invited to join him, and they would be fitted into this decimal system. So he had his pick of the best of not only his own men, but of the people he conquered. They were drawn into the system as well. They were given that choice: you join or you die.
Now, the expansion was rather rapid, because Temujin was born around 1160 or so, I believe.
Yes, there's some debate about that.
Yeah, and so he was probably in his 40s or so by the time he united things. He lived another 25 or 30 years, something like that. So it's just remarkable that in the 20 years of how much he expanded, because and then certainly his grandsons later expanded the empire out more. Let's talk a little bit about the idea of religion, because I know the most famous European tales of going to the Khan come from Marco Polo and a few other European travelers. I think after Genghis Khan's death, this would have probably been a few decades after. What was Mongol life like for the average citizen, be it in the steppes or in the conquered areas, and what was it like within the actual court of Khan?
Well, it was on the move. They had their order to continue on the move. The first city they built was built after his death, Karakoram. So they were not city dwellers. They were on the move all the time. They were mixed. As far as religion goes, yes, they were very tolerant of all religions. They were all shamans. They followed shamanism, which in itself is very eclectic. But there were Christians among some of the tribes, very few Muslims, but there were some, and there were Buddhists. But all in all, they were tolerant. Their attitude was they would like everybody they conquered, they wanted to pray for them, just in case.
In one of your emails to me, you had mentioned the Muslim, or rather the Mongols, being viewed as liberators from Islam as they expanded farther south. Was this after Temujin's death? Was this during the reign of his sons and grandsons?
Not at all. This was about 1218. If I could just recap. After 1206, he had to expand. He had to keep his followers happy. He had to continue conquering. He first of all hit the Sisir, or the Tangut, so-called the Tanguts. They were semi-sedentary people, semi-nomadic peoples. He conquered them first. He then switched his eye on the Gurchins. And as I said, there was resentment against the Gurchins. He used that. In other words, he contacted the Khitans who had been defeated. They helped him. They started to teach him their own military techniques of urban warfare, of siege warfare. And the Song dynasty, they also lent help. So he started to use the old Chinese history, these resentments, and he had help in defeating the Gurchins. When he turned his attention to the west, he had not intended to declare war on the Khwarizm Shah. He had not intended to declare war on the Muslim world. He didn't realize, he didn't think that he had the military might to conquer the Islamic world. That was not his intention. not many people know it, but it's well known, but it's not recognised that he was welcomed. The reason he was welcomed is that he was trying to finish unfinished business. There was a Prince Naiman, a Prince Naiman of the Naiman tribe. His name was Kuchluk. He had refused to submit to Genghis Khan, and he had fled west. He had found haven at the court of the Karakitai. The Karakitai were Khitans who had originally fled, from northern China in about 1120. Shall I go into detail about this?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
They had fled for the Gurchen in 1120, and they'd ended up settling in the Islamic world, on the borders of the Islamic world. They became known as the Karakitai. Why they're so well known is that they were the first group in the Islamic world to be accepted, to be recognized by the caliph in Baghdad, and yet they were infidels. The rulers were infidels, their subjects were Muslims, and yet they were eventually accepted. They ruled what today would be known as Eastern Turkestan or Western China. Some of their subjects were Uyghurs, most were Muslims. In about 1210, this prince, this Kuchluk, the Naiman prince, he went west and he was invited into the court of the Khitans. He accepted. They gave him safety. He was free from Genghis Khan, but they were still stepbrothers, so they felt incumbent to give him haven. He accepted this, but eventually he launched a coup d'état against them with the help of the Khwarazm Shah. Unusually for stepdwellers, he was not a tolerant man, and in fact, he insisted that his Muslim subjects either convert or he would kill them. And there's a very famous episode of this Kuchluk crucifying the Imam of Kashgar, to the walls of the mosque. So the Muslims of Eastern Turkestan had a very bad time. And it was about 1217 when Genghis Khan sent out his generals to capture this Kuchluk, who, if you remember, had refused to submit. It's then, when they came to the borders of the Islamic world, it's then that the Muslims welcomed them. They welcomed them. Why? Because Genghis Khan was after this Kuchluk who'd been murdering them and been putting them down. That was the first contact that the Muslim world had with the Genghisids, and as I say, they were welcomed, and they became loyal subjects. And this was just before Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Khwarazm Shah. But these first Muslim subjects of the Genghisids became powerful people in the empire eventually.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of other peoples that I wanted to mention. The Tanguts is one of those people that I think was one of the first examples of what would now be called ethnic cleansing, because I think they're almost virtually wiped from history. We don't really know much about them any longer. And you just mentioned, I think, the Khwarezmids, and I think there's the famous tale of the emperor or the emissary from the Khanate being sent there to open up diplomatic relations, being killed, and then Genghis Khan sent his troops in and they just wiped out a whole city. Is that correct?
The Tanguts, yes, this is one black mark against Genghis Khan, and it has never been satisfactorily explained. You're right, the Tanguts were the first people that he conquered. However, just before his death in 1227, he went back to the Tanguts. They had rebelled, and he went back, and as you said, it's been called the first example, certainly cultural genocide ever. He wiped them out. Why this happened has not been explained. It's out of character for Genghis Khan, certainly, that he went back and he was so vicious. Various theories have been put forward. There's a very famous film at the moment called Mongol.
I've seen it. I reviewed it, actually, yeah.
Well, that whole episode of Genghis Khan in jail, that's his explanation. There's no evidence at all for that episode. His explanation, it was that the Tangut had put him in jail and that finally he got his revenge. There's no evidence of that, but it's a theory for this missing year in the life of Genghis Khan. That Bogdanov, who made the film, that was his explanation of what happened. After Genghis Khan had conquered the eastern Turkestan, he turned his attention to the Khwarizm Shah, and he famously said, "You can be you can be the king of the west, and I can be the king of the east." He didn't think he could conquer him, but he made one mistake. When he sent his delegation, he said, "You, my son, can be king of the west. I will be king of the east." And the Khwarizm Shah said, "Who are you calling my son? My son." He took great exception to be called my son. And he ended up, he ended up killing Genghis Khan's envoys. The first envoys that Genghis Khan sent, the envoys, by the way, were Muslims. They were Muslims from this eastern Turkestan, this land which Genghis Khan had just taken over. This was a delegation of merchants. They had gone to explore this. They were killed. Genghis Khan didn't want to risk confrontation, and he sent another delegation, basically saying, "Look, this massacre was the deed of your lieutenants. Punish them, and we'll forget all about it." The Khwarizm Shah didn't. He himself ordered the killing of the second one. He robbed them, killed them, and he sent two of them back with their beards singed to reinforce his message. This was a declaration of war. Why the Khwarizm Shah did this, nobody knows. I mean, in hindsight, it's like committing suicide. But he was a man who believed in his own hubris. On paper, he looked powerful. He controlled the whole of Iran, all of Transoxiana, a very powerful man. But in reality, he wasn't at all. And he, of course, soon found this out. But when Genghis Khan launched his attack, he was out for revenge. He told us he attacked to get his revenge. And that was not typical of what he did. He was a strategist. But in this, he had to avenge the murder of his envoys, and that's something very basic. You don't kill Mongol envoys. It's
Well, let's end this segment on that note, and when we get back, I want to talk more then about how the empire basically prospered under Khan's Temujin's last few years, and then the transition into the sons and how the Khanates, the different 4 or 5 different Khanates arose and what happened over the next century or so, and we'll do that in a moment. All right, in this segment, I'd like to talk a little bit about, since we've gotten the empire going, the last few years of Temujin and the transition of power, because oftentimes you see throughout history that there is a bold visionary, and then what happens is once that person passes from the scene, the whole thing goes to hell, with squabbling and whatnot. But just as Temujin, Genghis Khan, had himself surrounded himself with great military leaders, it seems that most of his sons and grandsons were pretty good leaders, both politically and militarily themselves. So let's talk about the last couple of decades before he died. What did he do to expand and fortify the empire other than conquests? I know from what I've read elsewhere that the Mongols were very tolerant and whatnot, and people were able to basically retain their own cultures. But he didn't penetrate everywhere. He didn't really get into India. He didn't really get into Indochina or southern China. And I just mentioned before the break Japan. So let's talk about some of his goals of the last couple of decades.
Well, maybe this is why he survived so long, because there was a lot left undone when he died. He died, say, in 1227. He had just basically conquered the Islamic world, but as I say, that was out of revenge. So he did little other than conquer it, do a lot of destruction. He'd also sent his envoys around the Caspian Sea. This little established the Mongols' reputation for barbarity and bloodiness. They went, Jebe and Subire, his two generals, went around the Caspian. Initially, they'd been chasing the Khwarizm Shah. Remember the Khwarizm Shah who started this whole this war for the Islamic world? He had run away, literally run away after starting the war. He ran away. Jebe and Subire went to catch him. In the end, they left him to rot in peace on the small island in the Caspian, and they continued through the Caucasus, up to the Caucasus, and they went as far as Russia. Some horror stories are told about their journey. They did just destroy, but at the same time, they were not. They were allowing people to join them. There's a very famous story told that they were confronted by the Kipchak Turks. The Kipchak Turks were related to the Khwarizm Shah's mother, who had been defeated, and she herself had been taken prisoner by Genghis Khan. They were out for revenge. They met the Mongol armies, probably about in the Caucasus. The Mongol army were weighed down with baggage, with booty, and what have you. The Turks confronted them, and the Mongols fled. They dumped all their baggage, all their booty, all their loot, and they fled. And the Kipchak Turks apparently scoffed at them and said, "Huh, call yourselves a conquering army? What's this?" And they picked up all their booty and took it back with them up north. Of course, they hadn't read their Chinggisiid history. After they'd got up north, they were surrounded. The Mongols had followed them. They were surrounded them. They were defeated. And the Mongol armies took back all their booty, said thank you very much, and again a legend was born. They continued into Russia, and again they defeated the armies of the Rus. They weren't the Russians as we know them today. The armies of the Rus. They were defeated again. These were the classic knights in armor. They were defeated, and then word of these conquests started to filter back to Europe, and again. The stories, the Mongols or the Chinggisids used to encourage these stories of barbarity and bloodshed. They encouraged them. Often it was said that just their arrival at a town was enough for the people to submit. These horror stories preceded them. So people were given the option of surrendering or fighting. If they fought, they would be killed. If they surrendered, they were spared.
Well, let me just ask you, George, that brings up the idea, and I don't know if the Crusades was still going on at this time, but is it true that that Genghis Khan, the name Khan, was mistaken for the old legend of a Prester John, this Christian king out west, or is that just bunkum?
Partly not. It's not Genghis Khan. In fact, if you remember, I mentioned this Kutchluk, this person who oppressed the Muslims in eastern Turkestan. He was mistaken for Prester John. When word filtered back that someone from the east had come and defeated the Muslims, word filtered back, and the Crusaders thought, yes, now at long last, Prester John is arriving. Not Genghis Khan though. Okay. Unfortunately, they'd already heard of. They believed, you see, that he was one of the Tatars. This is the old name for the Turco-Mongols from the steppes, the Tatars. And Tatars, of course, is like Tartarus from hell. So people believe that these were the fabled Gog and Magog from hell coming to defeat them. But this was the legacy. Genghis Khan, then, when he died, the Islamic world, or as far as Iran, had been conquered. Not absorbed into the empire, it had just been conquered. Certain military governors were put in place, but otherwise not much had happened. Iran was just left to its own devices. There was anarchy. Northern China, the Gurchen, they had not been defeated by the time Genghis Khan had died. They were finally defeated in 1235. So in other words, a lot was left undone. So when Genghis Khan appointed his son Ogedai to succeed him, there was still plenty for Ogedai to do. And the empire was starting. He was accepted, and the sons were able to continue the good work. They didn't have time to squabble. In other words, there's plenty for them all to be getting on with. And Genghis Khan assigned them all areas. Batu, he was assigned Europe. Batu, by the way, was the son of his eldest Joki. Now, you may have heard that there was a question about Genghis Khan's eldest son. Genghis Khan, when he was on his rise, he had been defeated by a group called the Merkids. The Merkids had attacked him just after he was married, and they'd kidnapped his wife. Genghis Khan, famously, Genghis Khan left her alone. When the Merkids attacked, he fled and left his wife there to be captured. His reasoning was that if he had stayed, they'd all been killed. If he fled, they would spare his wife. And this is what happened. However, he went back and he released her. But unfortunately, she gave birth 9 months after her release. So there was always a big question mark about the paternity of his eldest son, Joki.
Well,
Genghis Khan, as far as he said, look, this is my son. I want to hear nothing more about this. Full stop, my son. That was it.
But given that 10 to 20% of the men in Asia seem to have Genghis Khan's DNA, according to latest science reports, I think it's a pretty good bet that there was some of his DNA floating about.
Yes, well, yeah, but his eldest son Joki, by the way, he died a year before his father. So that was one thing out of the way, because Genghis Khan accepted it, but his sons used to sometimes bring this up. So Joki died the year before Genghis Khan died. And therefore, Genghis Khan said, Ogedai will be my successor, and that was basically accepted. So it was a smooth transition.
Now, however, was Ogedai the father of Kublai Khan?
No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. And that's there was trouble later on. There was another coup. Ogedai's son Guyak eventually succeeded his father, but that's when trouble arose, and his reign caused a lot of resentment. Genghis Khan's youngest son Tului, it was his wife Sogakatani Beki. It was his wife who would go down in history as one of the greatest and strongest women leaders. She, after her husband's death, she devoted her life to making her sons succeed. She mounted a coup with the help of Batu, the son of Joki, Genghis Khan's eldest. Batu was sent to Europe to conquer. Now, Batu, because he was the son of Joki, he knew he could never be great Khan because of this thing about the paternity. So he accepted this role of kingmaker. He was very powerful. I mean, he conquered what is today Russia and Ukraine. Very powerful man. But he gave his backing to Sogakatani and her sons. And her sons were Monke, Kublai, Hulagu, Arikbuka. And when they came to the throne, they eventually split the empire, but they also made it great. They split the empire between those traditional Mongols who believed in the superiority of the steppe. They believed in the Yasa, the old ways, and the new thinkers, Monke and then Kublai, who believed in a multicultural empire which pulled on the greatness of all these traditions. And they established their kingdoms in China and then in Iran.
So let's just be clear then. So after Temujin, the founder Genghis Khan, died, the empire was then split between what, 4 siblings?
4.
Was that the genesis of the Khanates that eventually became the Golden Horde? And
basically, the Golden Horde was given to Batu.
Yeah.
Ogedai was very roughly given Central Asia. Chagadai would have been given Central China. And Tului, the youngest, was given the Mongolia. But these were very fluid. They didn't give them land as such. They gave them control over the peoples, the Ulus. And Ulus were the peoples who dwelt. So they were very fluid. Genghis Khan, remember, was still from the steppe. So he saw it as control over people. These became translated into boundaries later on with the later generations. Like Ogedai was the first Khan to build a city, Karakoram.
Yeah. Now let me just ask about some of the places that were not really directly touched by the reign of the Khanates. And I want to talk about India, Indochina, southern China, and Japan. Now, I would assume, just as a layman, that India and Indochina, it was probably the Himalayas, a geographic barrier that made it difficult to be conquered. And I don't know, in India, had the Mongols arisen by the time, the Mongols?
No, this was much later. The Mongols were, remember, descendants from Tamerlane. This was
okay.
a number of hundred years later. As near as they got was the Mongols conquered Yunnan province in southern China.
Yeah.
That became part of China under Monke Khan. And it was Kublai essentially who conquered that part. But they didn't get further. They had trade. They conquered Iran, but again there were other groups who prevented them from expanding into India. So as you say, the mountains were a barrier.
Yeah.
There were already people in place, so they didn't have the time in a sense. Certainly Genghis Khan didn't have the time.
And how about after his death? How about Korea and Japan? Because I've read that there were a couple of failed landings from Khanate fleets
This was under Kublai. Korea became part of the empire. That became a winning part. That was absorbed. But 2 attempts were made to attack Japan. Both failed for various reasons. Probably except that the boats. They were boat builders, but the boats that the Chinese excelled at making were often suitable for inland rivers, and they used these same and the kamikaze winds which wrecked them. But there were 2 attempts at Japan, both of which failed.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the kamikaze. That I guess helped give rise to the myth of the kamikaze that later got instilled in the Japanese psyche.
That's right. Yes, they saw that. Remember, at the time, people used to interpret all things as God, as coming from God, and as divine.
So now,
Genghis himself was considered the punishment of God.
Yeah. So let me talk then about now the rise of the Khanates. As you said, it wasn't over land so much as it was the people and the tribes. We're talking about, I know Kublai Khan eventually was settled in China. The Golden Horde, I believe, was the farthest western of the Khanates. So was it the Golden Horde that, or what would become the Golden Horde, that part of the empire that was striking into like Bulgaria and Hungary when Temujin died? And because the legend is that Europe was basically spared only because they were called back to because
that's right, but it was not Temujin.
No,
it was when Ogedai died.
Okay.
When he died, they had to go back, and that's basically what saved Europe.
Yeah.
We could be studying Mongolia at Oxford and Cambridge if it wasn't for that. No, you're quite right. They would. I mean, in a sense, this is a democracy. When the great Khan died, the princes had to return to elect or decide upon the new leader. So when Ogedai died, they were all recalled to do this. When Ogedai died, Guyak succeeded him, and Batu refused, in fact, to attend. He did withdraw from the front line in Europe, but he never actually attended, and this was a bone of contention between the two. Monke came to power. Monke was the son of Tului. He came to power thanks to his mother, Sokagatani Beki. That was a coup, and it eventually split the empire. There was a bloodletting, and one whole generation of the sons of Ogedai and the sons of Chagadai were basically wiped out. The Tuluids took over, so the Tuluids came to power.
And who were they? Were they a different
Tuluids were the sons of. This was Kublai Khan. They were the sons of Tului, who was married to Sokagatani Beki. Monke Khan came to power, and this is when things changed a lot. In his coronation of 1251, there was a delegation from Iran. Iran had been conquered in 1222, and since then it was basically left in the house. They had military governors, and nobody, as you know, nobody likes a military government. There was a military government. There was there were various other armed elements rampaging around the city. So Iran had been left in chaos. Iran, by the way, had not been Iran for about 600-700 years. Iran ceased to be Iran after the Arab invasion, the Islamic invasion, when the Muslims had come out of the West in the 7th century. Iran became Azerbaijan, Khorasan, it became Sistan, it became all these various provinces, and it ceased to be a united country. When the Iranians sent a delegation to Monkey's coronation, they asked something. Well, again, this is all written in history books, but people choose to ignore it. Monkey had his coronation, and all the people from all the parts of the empire came. A delegation from Iran came, and the delegation asked that Monkey send a prince to Iran. They asked that he send an army. They asked that he send an army, first of all, to defeat the Ismailis, that is the assassins you may have heard of. Yeah. That was their thing. They wanted that. But basically, they wanted Iran to be restored to its former glory. The Iranians were aware that an awful lot of individual Iranians were quite active throughout the empire and quite successful. Remember, when the Mongols, when Genghis Khan had conquered an area, people joined his armies, yes, but also artisans were moved around. He would get whole villages of, say, carpet makers, and he would transpose them to China. Artisans were considered booty. So there was a huge population movement during these years. Whole villages were just shifted. When they were shifted, these people, when they were moved, they had no hope of ever going home. They knew this. So they, in fact, their children would become very loyal citizens of this new state. They had no hope of going home. So their only chance of surviving is if they were loyal to the Genghisid commanders who were in charge of the area. So a whole generation of migrants arose. In Iran, people saw that individual Iranians were doing quite well, and they were aware that these Persian speakers, and Persian had become almost a lingua franca of the empire. It seemed ridiculous that Persian was spoken throughout the empire. Individual Iranians were doing very well, but in Iran itself, they were in chaos, in anarchy. This delegation went to Monkey and said, please send us a prince. Come and take direct control of our country. We don't want to be a border region. And that's what happened. A huge army was sent to Iran to incorporate Iran into the empire proper.
Now,
they no longer wanted to be peripheral.
Now, when you say Iran, was that the name of the people then, or were they still called the Persians? Because Persians are the...
Persian is a British term. Persian is British. It comes from one of the provinces, Fars. Okay. No, Iranians is the ancient term. They've always been Iranians. Okay. But they ceased when the Muslims took over. It ceased because it ceased to be united. It ceased to be called Iran. When Hulagu, Monkey sent his brother Hulagu. He sent one brother Kublai to continue the war in China, to continue subduing China, and he sent his son, his brother Hulagu, to Iran. This was in 1254. When Hulagu arrived in Iran, Iran started to be called Iran again. This was the first time in 700 years. And as I say, if you look back at the history books, during those first years of the Muslim years, it's not Iran. Hulagu arrived and he was welcomed, and Iran became Iran again.
Okay, well let me just establish the timeline. So when Ogedai died, and between Ogedai and Kublai being the Great Khan, it was about a 10 or 12 year period. And who was the Great Khan? Was that Guyuk?
Okay, no. After Ogedai died, his son ruled for a few years.
And that's Guyuk. Guyuk.
Yes. When Guyuk died, Monkey ruled from 1250 until 1259. Yeah. Then, after he died, his brother Kublai became Great Khan. That was in 1260, and that's when the empire officially split.
Yeah, but from what
when Monkey became Great Khan, it was unofficially split. But because of this massacre, nobody could oppose him. 1260, they recovered, and the empire is split between Kublai and his brother Hulagu in Iran, and the northern Mongols, who were more traditionalist.
Yeah. So, but let me just understand. Was the interregnum between Ogedai and Kublai, was that considered sort of a down period in the history? And
not at all. No, because Monkey was one of four brothers. They were all the so-called Tuluids. Monkey, Hulagu, who went to Iran, and Kublai, who went to China. Kublai and Hulagu were brothers. China, Iran became subdued. It became the Ilkhanate. That was in 1258. The Ilkhanate was founded. In 1279, the Yuan dynasty was founded. That's when Kublai finally subdued China.
Yeah.
China took a little bit longer to be subdued. It wasn't a pitched battle. It wasn't basically it was the Chinese bit by bit going over to Kublai's side. It was a protracted war. But in 1279, China officially became part of the empire. You had the Yuan and you had the Ilkhanate in Iran, and they were united.
Okay, so because Kublai Khan is the most famous of that generation, I just want to establish them. So he has the most people. He's basically, I guess, considered the more, if not by blood lineal descent, but that's considered more of the real power, is it not? The other Khanates out west, you know, was sort of going their own way. But if we're looking for sort of the cultural history or the effect, the biggest effect, is Kublai considered the most powerful and the most influential?
Yes, certainly. He came to power in 1260. He was only recognized by Hulagu in Iran, but in fact, he was. The Khanates were briefly united in 1305, and it was a Yuan Khan who was the thing. So, in reality, yes, he continued to be the strongest. He recognized by Hulagu in Iran. So Iran and China were politically united.
Yeah. So let's talk about then sort of the other Khanates going. We have maybe 4 or 5. So the Golden Horde, was that what eventually founded the more modern? The Ottomans were the Ottomans already established, or did they come from?
No, they're not really connected. The Golden Horde ruled in what is today Russia and Ukraine. They were the majority of the people there were Turkic and Turkish speaking, and in fact they became quite early on. They became Turkish speaking almost officially. Mongolian was still we've got records written in Mongolian in Iran right up into the 1400s, up in the 1300s. We've got Mongolians written, but in the Golden Horde, the Chipkat Turks predominated, and it became very much the dominant peoples with Turkey. They were powerful, but because of their history with the paternity, they could never take on that role of being the great Khans. The Chagadids and the Ogadids continued in the steppelands, and they maintained their traditions and their connections with the steppe. But because of that, they became almost peripheral to other things. The power and the majesty of the state remained with China and Iran.
Now, I just because a lot of names are thrown out here, I just want to just ask it now. I know you mentioned when I mentioned the Mongols, you talked about Tamerlane. He's not considered. He's in no way a lineal descendant of Temujin and his family.
No.
But was he? Did he arise out of one of the Khanates later, a few centuries later?
Yes, he used the Chagaday Khanate in order to get legitimacy. He married a Chagaday princess, and this is how his official title was the royal son-in-law. So he had a Chagaday Khan in his pocket. Nobody even knows the name. I forget the name. So, in actual reality, Tamerlane wasn't the great Khan. He was the leader, but in fact he had a Khan who was his senior, and he married a wife to get himself legitimacy. When he died, his descendants, of course, founded the Mongols, and they moved to India.
Okay.
So but there's and the same with the Ottomans. There's a lot of dispute about where exactly the Ottomans came from, but there's some say that they were a breakaway group from the Golden Horde, the so-called Nogedaids, a breakaway Khan from the Golden Horde, is supposedly founded the Ottomans in Anatolia. But again, that's disputed.
Well, let me just end this segment, and I want to focus on first the accomplishments of Kublai Khan, and then I want to go back and talk about the actual mythic death of Genghis Khan or Temujin. So I want to, with Kublai, since he's after Genghis, he's considered, I guess, the greatest of the Khans. Let's talk about his influence in China, because it seems to me that of all the dynasties of the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, his may have been one of the briefest ones, but it seems to me to have been inordinately important. Or am I wrong on that?
I think you are. He founded the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty lasted from, say, 1260 until 1369. It went into slow decline after his death. He died in 1294, and it went into slow decline. But it was still taking, for example, the modern Chinese historians, they've been resentful because they viewed the Mongols as foreigners. So they've often downplayed any influence and any importance. But in the last 10 years, that attitude has been reversed, and now they're recognizing that this was a very important time, and culturally a very rich time. For example, for ceramics, there was trade. If you've got to remember that China and Iran were linked. They were linked by trade routes and culturally. So there was a lot going on between the two, especially ceramics. The period is also famous for its drama. Not many people know, but apparently Yuan drama was famous. They've often been put down, but I think it's an exciting period for me to research, because so much now is coming to light, and it's finally been recognised for the importance it was.
Well, let me then end this segment and going back to Temujin, because other than maybe the Gordian knot that Alexander supposedly came upon, Alexander the Great, the death and the burial and the mystery of the body of Temujin Genghis Khan, I think one of the great sort of mysteries of world history. So if you could talk a little bit about first the myth, and then what we know now, if we know anything about where possibly his body was, because the Egyptians celebrated their kings and burial sites, and they were raided and looted and whatnot. So I would assume that the Mongols and Temujin didn't want this.
The opposite. They apparently they buried their kings with a lot of the jewels and loot and what have you, but it was always kept secret, very secret. There's a story told in Rashid ad-Din that the body of Genghis Khan was put under the ground, and then all the men who were involved in the actual burial were murdered afterwards.
Yeah.
How true that was, who knows? But now there's people who regularly appear claiming that they've found the body and they're digging it up and what have you. But it's not known. I probably know as much as you. Periodically people say they've discovered where it is, but we don't know. I believe the Japanese are nearest to discovering it.
Okay. Well, let's end this segment, and in the next segment, let's talk about sort of the decline and fall of the Khanates, all of them, and their legacy afterwards, and we'll do that when we get back. All right. I wanted in this segment to talk a little bit about sort of the post-Kublai Khan Empire, but you had mentioned you wanted to talk a little bit and shoot down some of the myths, starting with Hulagu as a butcher. So go ahead, George.
Again, going back to Möngke Khan's coronation, Möngke sent his two brothers off to consolidate the empire. He sent Kublai to China to continue the conquest of China, and he sent Hulagu to Iran. But remember, Hulagu went with the consent of the Iranians. He was welcomed. His journey to Iran took him from about 1254 to 1256. He went with a huge army, but it was not on a war footing. He was welcomed. The only military confrontations he had in Iran itself were with it had been requested that they be destroyed. In 1256, Hulagu destroyed the headquarters of the Ismailis, Alamut. He then turned his attention to Baghdad. When he was sent to Iran, he had a remit. He was told that he must destroy the assassins, and that he must ask the Caliph of Baghdad to submit. Now, Hulagu, his court was full of Muslims, Iranian Muslims, the most famous of whom was Javaini, the historian. That's why we know so much about this period. This idea that the Mongols were anti-Muslim there's no basis whatsoever. It's a total myth. It's built partly on the destruction of the Khwarizm Shah, but as I say, the attack on the Khwarizm Shah was nothing about attacking Muslims. It was about attacking a king who had murdered Mongol envoys. When Genghis Khan, when Hulagu advanced on Baghdad in 1258, he wanted the Caliph to submit. He surrounded it. He gave the Caliph all the chances he possibly had. The Caliph refused. He refused to negotiate, and eventually Hulagu attacked. However, a few things worth mentioning. Hulagu employed local armies. The armies which actually took part were Iranians. Each of the city-states in Iran sent soldiers. These were the actual people who fought on the ground. He also found allies in the Kurds. The Kurds gave their support, and also the Shia. Baghdad, for some years before the arrival of Hulagu, had been involved in a civil war between the Sunni and the Shia. These were fighting, and the Shia had contacted Hulagu and had pledged loyalty. As well as this, 1 year before Hulagu arrived, there had been a devastating flood. The flood had almost destroyed Baghdad itself. So when Hulagu destroyed Baghdad, the idea that he plunged in with his infidel armies and burnt the city to the ground is ridiculous. The idea also that he destroyed the whole place is no truth. It's said that he burned all the libraries. This is a famous story that Hulagu burnt the libraries of Baghdad. He didn't. There's no evidence whatsoever. In fact, the worst that he could be accused of is that he stole the books. The books were moved. They were moved nearby into Iran to an observatory owned by someone called Tusi, Nasiruddin Tusi. He had helped. He was a Shia. He had helped Hulagu negotiate with the Caliph, and as a reward, Hulagu built him an observatory, and he also built him a university. And Tusi claimed all the books of Baghdad, and he moved them. How do we know this? We've got sources close to Tusi, but we also have Mamluk sources. People from Baghdad, they accused Hulagu and Tusi of being a thief, and they were angry that he had stolen their books. So again, common misconceptions. The idea that Hulagu burnt Baghdad to the ground is not true. He didn't destroy the libraries, and the destruction was selective.
Okay. Before we get into, as I mentioned, the decay, I was just looking at some of the notes you had sent me. You had also said you wanted to talk about the Salafist movement.
Yes. The modern day Salafist movement, it finds its roots in a thinker from this time. One of the reasons that the Mongols in general, but Hulagu in particular, is known as being an infidel and anti-Muslim is because of the Mamluks. The Mamluks, who by the way, ethnically they were Mongols and Turks, but they were great enemies of the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhanate was ruled by Persians. The Mamluks, soldiers were Turks and Mongols, but the people were Arabs, and that's centuries-old rivalry between Arabs and Turks. The Mamluks were converts to Islam, and they accused the Persians of being infidels, ruled by infidels. Their champion was someone called Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah was a fundamentalist thinker, and he would not accept that Persians and Mongols could be proper Muslims. His thoughts and his ideology is at the basis of a lot of Salafist and jihadist thinking to this day. And as I say, if you go online and download Ibn Taymiyyah's books, you'll probably get a phone call from MI5 or the CIA or whoever. People who download Ibn Taymiyyah's thoughts are viewed rather suspiciously. But we know so much about him because Ibn Taymiyyah was involved with an intellectual battle with Rashid ad-Din, who was the prime minister for one of the Ilkhanate Khans. Rashid ad-Din, his interpretation of jihad has been basically a battle with your own soul, about cleansing and fighting the evil within your own soul. Contradicted Ibn Taymiyyah, who said that jihad was fighting the infidel, destroying the infidel. So that battle which they played out in the medieval courts has been played out to this day.
Okay, well, let me ask a few questions that getting to some misconceptions. Now, I know if you look online, you'll see maps of the supposed extent, the largest extent of the empire. Number one, at what point was it at its largest extent? And if it was actually once Kublai Khan came to power, split, then are we talking about two actually different states then, or was it still one empire? And
well, again, it's definition. I mean, this was a huge empire, and then how does anyone control it anyway? But it was Kublai Khan was not recognized by the Golden Horde or the Chagidites or the Oghidites. They did not recognize him.
As the Great Khan.
As the Great Khan. So as Great Khan, Kublai ruled over all modern-day China, Mongolia, and Hulagu recognized it. So that would have included Iran, Turkey, modern-day Pakistan, I suppose, and half the Caucasus. But Central Asia was a battleground. Unfortunately, that meant that the land route between the Yuan and the Ilkhanate was disrupted, and that means that the trade often went by the Indian Ocean. For example, Marco Polo, when he returned, he had to go via the Indian Ocean. He came back by sea. And when he went through Afghanistan, through that little
Khyber Pass,
toe of Afghanistan, up through the Pamirs. So it's difficult to say when it was at its greatest, but as you say, Mongol Khans were ruling the empire at its greatest, I suppose, in the 1280s. When it ceased to expand. Now you mentioned the Ain and Jalut, the battle with the Mamluks. That was in 1260, and often that's seen as a decisive battle. In fact, militarily, it was nothing. This was the battle that the Ilkhanate had with the Mamluks of Egypt. And it's said that this was the first defeat that the Mongol armies had ever really experienced. It was not quite true. What happened was that Monkey, the great Khan Monkey, had died. Hulagu had started to go back to Karakoram. While he was away, the Mamluk army attacked the remnants of Hulagu's army in Palestine, Ain and Jalut, and it was defeated. That's all, nothing more. Hulagu came back and there was a stalemate. But that was all the battle. But symbolically, word got out that the Mongols were not invincible. And suddenly, that's why it's so important.
So
after that, by the way, it was then when Kublai launched his attacks on Japan. Two more very well publicized defeats.
So before the year 1300, Kublai Khan died. Did the empires and the Khanates then just slowly split into smaller and smaller factions? Did the Mongol Empire not get defeated, but just sort of go out with a whimper rather than a bang?
Well, yes and no. They were briefly united in 1305. All of them, all the parts were briefly. Nothing what happened. It's said that the Golden Horde, in one form or another, survived until the 18th century, but again, that's disputed. The Ilkhanate, they survived until 1335. After the death of the young Abu Said, he had no son, and so there was civil war, a dispute, and that was it. The Mongols never returned from Iran, but they were just absorbed. In China, the Yuan Empire was defeated, and he actually rode back to Mongolia with his army. But again, this idea that the Mongols left China is ridiculous. I mean, the Yuan court, or the peoples who the Genghisids, there were millions and millions of them. The emperor left with a few hundred soldiers, his court army. So the Mongols left China. No, it's playing with words. So they were just absorbed by the Ming when they came. The same with other groups. The Chagadayids, they were simply absorbed by various groups. Tamerlane, of course, when Tamerlane came along, he was another great conqueror, and these various peoples were absorbed into his states. So it's not easy to say the Mongol Empire finished here.
Yeah. So when is it generally accepted that the Mongols have passed from, if not, they might have still existed in some parts, but being a superpower, being the Asian superpower?
Oh, but by 1350 they were on their last legs in China and everywhere.
So
in
we're
Iran,
talking. So we're talking basically that the Mongol Empire lasted about a century and a half, basically, classically speaking. So let me ask then a couple of questions more specifically. What, starting with Temujin and through some of the military, and I don't know if you're a military tactician, but what were some of the military tactics that made them so successful against armies that, as you mentioned, was sometimes 2, 3, 5 times the size?
The subterfuge, I suppose, but obviously they were very skillful horsemen. They could fire on horseback and fire behind, so they were extremely efficient and effective horsemen. But they did have a lot of techniques. I've already mentioned this one, that they feigned retreat, and then they would conduct ambushes. Yeah. They would, for example, they would often when they stopped at the night, they would light campfires, hundreds of campfires. So from afar, they would often appear much greater than they actually were. When they galloped, they would drag small trees and bushes behind them. In other words, to create this great dust clouds. Yeah. Again, it gives this impression that they're a great figure. They created this myth of their invincibility and also of their barbarity. People were so fearful of them that they often just submitted. There's stories that told that apparently a Mongol lined some people up ready to kill them, and he had forgotten his sword. So he told people to stay in line while he went to get his sword. And when he came back, they were still there waiting to be beheaded. All sorts of these stories went around about how many are true, who knows. But they were very successful, and until in Jalut, it was said they'd never be defeated. In fact, not quite true, but...
Well, let me ask about the technology, military technology. Did the empire contribute anything in terms of the development of spears or crossbows or anything else?
Gunpowder.
Gunpowder.
They bought gunpowder. They bought gunpowder from China and introduced it to the Islamic. That's still controversial. One reason it's a bit controversial is that in the Islamic sources, the Muslim sources, there's no direct reference to gunpowder. But this could simply be that they didn't realise. A lot of the people didn't realise what the gunpowder and what this was. There were odd things to fire sticks and one thing and another. And by carefully looking, it's reckoned that they started to use gunpowder in the battles against the Mamluks. But again, that's still a bit controversial. There's a scholar called Stephen Hoare who's been writing about this recently, and said, in fact, there was a lot more widespread than they've been credited with recently.
Let's talk about some cultural things in the arts or things in medical advances, scientific advances. Did the Khanates were they encouraging of technology and medical advances? And you had mentioned a little bit, I think, of drama. Talk a little bit about the arts and sciences in the Khanates.
Very much so. It was a huge period of cultural exchange. That, I think, is their legacy. Not the when they came roaring out of the steppe with Genghis Khan, yes, it was all plunder and what have you. But that whole period it was gone by the 1230s. Um, they were very sophisticated and cultured people. They it's often been said that they were the muscle, and it was their Persian and Chinese advisors who actually ran the empire. This isn't true. It was Genghis Khan and his close advisors. They did. We know a lot about the culture exchange because of someone called Rashid ad-Din, and he's charted this. But medicine, history, of course, um, plants, uh, agriculture, ceramics, action art, um, the gold thread brocade. Uh, to mention the Mongols, if we think, if we think of ancient Rome or whatever, we often think of the kind of things they did for leisure. Um, uh, Lion baiting or hunting. The Mongols used to put on debates. They had intellectual debates. They used to stage this in all the courts all the time. They were very thirsty for knowledge, and they surrounded themselves with knowledgeable people right from the beginning. They set up universities. For example, there was the Hanlin set up in China. This was twinned with the observatory I mentioned in Iran, and they exchanged intellectuals, philosophers, thinkers would go from one to the other, and the courts would encourage this at all times. All Mongol courts. So this was a period of great cultural expansion, and the Yuan and the Ilkhanate in particular. They took the best out of the cultural contributions from the various groups which made up their courts. There was an exhibition recently in Los Angeles and I think it was in New York, on the arts of the Genghisids. It was wonderful, and just to look at the art that was produced and to think of these people as barbarian is a complete contradiction. So no, I think that is again part of their legacy, is their cultural contributions.
Okay, let me ask then, and let me
One last thing. There was a book written in 2000 by Thomas Alson. It was called Culture and Conquest. That had a great influence on thinking since then. But that maps out just how huge their cultural contribution was.
Yeah. Let me return this to the beginning when I opened up talking about the reason I wanted to do a show about Genghis Khan and the Mongols. I've always viewed them him specifically, as I said, as an influential person, if not the most influential of the last 1,000 years, as sort of a bottleneck person. And it seems to me, and again, I'm just a layman who's read books by people like you, that the Mongols, and you can call them the Chinggisids, the Mongols, the Khanates, whatever you want to call them, that the modern world would be significantly different if they didn't exist, and there probably wouldn't have been the Mongol Empire if Temujin hadn't existed. I mean, if you're doing one of these kind of alternate history things, what do you think? How do you think things would have played out? Do you think China might have grown more in influence? Do you think that the Muslims would have conquered Europe and made Christianity, say, a Scandinavian cult? If you could rewind the clock back to 1160 or so and make Temujin's parents not meet, how do you think things would have played out?
I don't know. You often think that if he hadn't come along, something similar. I mean, he united East and West. He opened doors, but you could argue that they would have opened eventually anyway. No, as far as the Islamic world, do remember that this is a total myth that he put them back centuries. He didn't. If anything, he encouraged it. He put the Arab cause back, and he rose up the Persian. So the myth that he was anti-Islamic and he put the Muslims back a bit, that's just not true at all. There's no evidence of that at all. But um, I don't know what would have in China. I can't visualize it. It's conjecture. I don't know. His great contribution is that he opened up doors, opened up avenues, and he allowed cultures to see other cultures. Now, would that have happened anyway? Eventually. So maybe he just speeded things up by a century or so.
Okay. Well, let's end this segment. We'll get back. We'll wrap up the interview, and I'll give you a final say on anything else you want to talk about. We'll do that in a moment. Well, I think it's been a very informative and productive interview, and I thank George for his time. I want to, in this final segment, just give George a chance to talk about what he's got coming up in his own research. But I just wanted to, before he does that, just ask him if there's one or two major points or myths that you want to dispel about Temujin, the Khanates, the empire. What would they be?
I think the legacy is positive rather than negative. I think the picture that's often given or painted of Genghis Khan and the Chinggisids concentrates on the brutality of the first decade or so, and not enough on the cultural legacy which they've left. My own research has been concentrating on China during this period. They were far closer than people have appreciated. At present, I'm working on finishing off a book on Hangzhou, which is a large Chinese town near to Shanghai. This was the capital of the Song, and it became the cultural capital of Kublai's Yuan dynasty. I discovered there a mosque with 21 tombstones written in Persian, which we in fact dug up in 1921. This points to the presence of a substantial Iranian community living in Hangzhou. They'd gone out there in about 1284, apparently at the invitation of Kublai. Again, there was rich contact between China and Iran, and now with the Chinese themselves recognizing that the Yuan was an important period, I foresee a rich future in this direction of research.
Okay, well, then just end this interview, and if you have any going on any other future digs or what's coming up in the next year or two for you in terms of either books or your own research.
I've got a book by Oxford University Press, which is in the process of coming out. That's looking at this is a new look at the Mongols in general from a more positive perspective. Myself, I'll be traveling out again to China, seeing what else I can discover. But again, looking for these contacts between China and Iran. I hope also to go to Iran. The same thing, because we haven't got that much evidence of of Chinese presence in Iran. We know they were there, but there's not much hard physical evidence, and I'd be delighted if I could find that. But I live in hope.
Well, I want to thank you for your insights and especially your exuberance. It's always good to have someone who really loves to talk about their métier. And for anyone who enjoyed this interview about the Mongol Empire with George Lane, you can look below this video and you'll see a link to George's homepage, and you can find out more about him or contact him if you have any questions. Just for people who are watching my show, in the next week I will have another show on poetry translation and one talking with a physicist about the meaning of existence. So we've gone from the Mongols to poetry to existence. So again, George Lane, thank you for your time.
Thank you.